Facciamo insieme. Ma è quello che è lui che ha provato, non io, lui che ha provato, mi ha detto quasi come una cosa ferale, cioè, non sono pronto a fare il nonno, hai capito? Sono pronto a fare il nonno, questa è l'idea, capito? Come faccio il nonno, cioè, il tema. Tu dici che no, però siamo già un po' in anticipo che sta rompendo ancora, eh? Aspettiamo 2 minuti perché ma ci sono 6 in contemporanea, però aspetta un attimo che quando questi si riempie sempre. Dopo dove mi metto io?
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
che si impegna, che si batte,
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo esiste anche grazie a te.
Buongiorno.
So good morning, and welcome to this meeting entitled More Than a Market, From Neoliberalism to Human-Centered Development in the European Union. After the Draghi report, a second major report on Europe was released last year, and we are discussing it, and we're honored because of the fact that this report was the responsibility of another great Italian, Enrico Letta. Besides being a protagonist in the European and Italian economic and political life, he's a dear friend of the Rimini meeting. I still remember when he came here to Maurizio Lupi promoting the parliamentary group for subsidiarity, and in 2011 we designed an exhibition on 150 years of subsidiarity that was officially opened by President Napolitano, and then he came here on several other occasions. Here, too, the topic is the following. So Europe, the focus will be on Europe and economic aspects. As we've often said at the meeting, these are aspects that are very close to us. We're going to discuss actually where Europe is going. This is something that is of concern for everybody in a rapidly changing world. In the 1980s, there was no competition with India and China. Back then, they made up for 4% of the world economy. Now they make up for 25% of the world economy. And Enrico used to say something that I like to repeat. Back then, Italy was a big country in a small world. Now Italy is a small country in a big world, and so it needs Europe to live. This question is fundamental for us to live. So the question is that we feel that it seems that Europe is losing in rapidity, in speed, and there is actually a close relationship between peripheral areas that are depopulated and urban centers that are becoming bigger and bigger. This is a topic that Enrico has delved upon in his report. The single market without social cohesion cannot guarantee a long-lasting and stable development. Hence, the idea of development cannot be of a neoliberalist development, but rather of a form of development that has to be conceived based on welfare systems. So systems in which universities, schools, and hospitals are an integral part of this development. There are some fundamental elements being addressed in Enrico's report. He talks about the 4 freedoms of the single market. So goods, services, people, and capitals. These 4 freedoms, however, are not enough in a rapidly changing world. We need a 5th one, including innovation, research, human capital, and skills of various nature. And he says this is actually the manifesto of Europe for the next 5 years. However, this type of development, which is very dear to us because education and knowledge, as well as innovation, starting from the person, are at the core of this development. All of this needs a true single market, true European market. So Enrico's major proposal, in my view, and I think it is still topical, it is increasingly topical now, is that there should be a reinforced supranational law which touches upon the 27 EU member states that can contribute building a common capital, going above fragmentation, overcoming fragmentation, and avoiding ideological clash. As Enrico said, that's the idea of European Union promoted by Jacques Delors, that is to say, not eliminating national identities, but rather building an identity on various levels, aware of the fact that there are several fundamental elements that we find only in Europe. For example, welfare universalism, or the universalism of education and of the health system, of healthcare. So the idea is to rethink our idea of single market. The single market doesn't only mean neoliberalism or the selfishness of the individuals that leads to a collective well-being, but rather something new that this supranational law can bring with itself. In other words, a market that is human-centered, so with human capital at the center, at the core of the market, and as the report states, so the Erasmus program, Horizons, as well as entrepreneurial projects, and so on and so forth. Actually, we do not realize that many of us, every single day, every year, we take advantage of the benefits coming from these programs, without which we could not go on. I mean, think of universities without these kind of programs. And then second, economic biodiversity. We need SMEs as well as big companies as well as multinationals. They're all needed. It is as if we had a forest where you have, for example, small, low vegetation and high trees. And then, for example, the individual is not in isolation, but the person lives within communities. So the idea is to have a third sector, and above that, social realities communicating with the state and with the businesses. And then fourth, the combination between welfare and development. That is to say, not just the fact that you can accumulate wealth in any way by impoverishing people, for example, but rather we should focus on a new idea of development within which the way in which people feel good is promoted and valued. So a model in which inequalities are fought against. So from this point of view, we are going to discuss these topics with Enrico. We know that Enrico is a great politician, but he's also the dean of the School of Politics and the president of the Jacques Delors Institute, and he now lives in Madrid, Paris, and Italy. In other words, Enrico Letta is also a great academic scholar. So besides Enrico, we have three very important personalities who will bring the view of three different institutions. Professor Chelli, the president of the Italian Statistical Institute, ISTAT, who's a dear friend of mine. He will be able to give us an overview of the economy, starting from his viewpoint as a profound expert of data. And then we have the subjects who can tell us whether this vision contained in the report is of value today when we talk about customs duties or when we question the idea of a global market, and when, for example, we start talking again about neo-corporativism. Then we have Sergio Marullo di Condojanni, the CEO of Angelini SPA, one of the most important Italian and international pharma companies.
Mattarella, che è...
And then Bernardo Mattarella, the CEO of Invitalia. Who can give us his view of state intervention as a fundamental aspect, in my view, of development. And he's also a dear friend of the Rimini meeting. Every year he participates at various sessions here. So we're going to proceed as follows. We will ask Chelli and Marullo di Condojanni, as well as Mattarella, to basically make some initial remarks. Then we will have Enrico's contribution, and then there will be a reply from the three of you to liven up a bit the discussion. So I'd like to leave the floor to Professor Chelli so that he can give us an overview of where we stand in 2025, at least from an economic viewpoint. First of all, thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers for their kind invitation. I'm very honored. I'm pleased to give you an overview. I'd like to thank the organizers, and I actually greet the outstanding co-speakers. I'd like to have my slides, please. Before talking about the Italian economy, and I'm going to be as complete as possible, I'd just like to tell you that Italy is facing complex challenges from the point of view of our demography, as well as from a social and economic standpoint. These challenges couldn't be faced if Italy if not at a European level. So Europe has been capable of setting up an IT system made up of the national statistical office of the member states and of Eurostat. That's a fundamental support to know, to learn a bit more about these challenges and face them and be able to face them. So from this point of view, this is an IT, this is an information support which is actually the subject of envy from the part of other countries, because it provides homogeneous and quality data. This is the first information I'd like to share with you. The Italian economy is slowing down, and the reason for this is that the temporary data recently released on the Italian GDP is telling us that we've registered a minus 0.1 compared to the previous quarter. And the previous quarter it was minus 0.3. If this is confirmed, well, we will know next Friday when we have the new data, which will be the final one and not the temporary one, on the second quarter of 2025. This is mainly due to the foreign component, so consumption, investments, and production has been maintained, and this is due to the strong geopolitical tensions we are going through. To achieve our growth goals, we will have to fully implement the NRRP, as well as all the investments that have been funded from it. If you look at the right chart, you can see that Italy's trend is in line with that of the main economies. Actually, we mainly compare ourselves with Germany, Spain, and France. But Germany is actually the country under focus. You can see from the yellow line that its economy is still sluggish. And as we are the first partner of Germany in terms of import-export, clearly a slow trend of the German economy has repercussions on our economy as well. Exports are growing up. This means that we are anticipating times. In other words, exports are growing over the last 6 months. So in the first 6 months of 2025, a growth in trade, in export trade, has been registered. Sorry. We have not measured the impact of the final custom rate duties. However, last March, we carried out a study based on individual companies to check the vulnerability of Italy as a system. In other words, Italian companies in view of a possible very restrictive custom rate policy. And actually, we checked this vulnerability index by focusing on focused products, the concentration of products, so focusing on companies that have a very limited palette of products, and the other companies who have more than 50% of their turnover in exports. Vulnerable companies classified in this way are about 3,300. In general, we have slightly more than 23,000 companies. However, these 23,000 companies, only 23% of the total, make up of about 17% of exports. So this means that these vulnerability factors can have an impact, also a very strong, a very heavy impact on our foreign trade. Let me give you 2 other figures which are very important. The first one concerns inflation. Inflation is stable. Our inflation is 1.7%, and that's below the European average. However, this average value also features lots of differences. Actually, inflation has gone up from 2.8 to 3.2%. That means that food commodities, processed and not, and essential services, so for example, transport and healthcare, have basically gone up in price. And this has been counterbalanced by the diminishment of energy price increase. So clearly, this is affecting differently different chunks of the population. So probably the poorer parts of the population will be hit by this, and this will bring about disequalities. Then we have 363,000 more jobs between June 24 and June 25. This is an important piece of information. So the labor market is going up. So the number of those in employment over 50 years of age is going up, and this concerns both men and women. It should be stressed, however, that we are still far away from the European average rate, because we are now at 62.9%, while in Europe the average is over 70%. And that's the goal we should achieve in 2030. This slide shows three figures which represent three challenges for Italy and Europe. Our annual report was devoted to these three topics. First, productivity. Productivity can be measured in different ways. It's a very timely, punctual measurement is to measure productivity per hour and not per employee, to take the number of hours worked into account. So since 2024, productivity has gone up by 0.7%. Of course, I'm not addressing this in detail. I'm not going to delve into this in detail. However, innovation and research are here fundamental. Productivity grows and goes up if it grows because it is boosted by innovation and research. The second figure is now acknowledged by everybody. The Italian aging population. Our average age is 46.6 years of age. It's very high. This depends on the low fertility rate in Italy and the longevity of our population. And longevity is good news. It's not negative. However, these two things taken together, so low fertility rate and long longevity, mean that our aging population is growing more and more. And the third number, tells us a lot about vulnerabilities. This is the figure of people under 16 who are at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Actually, I'm referring here of minors under 16, which make up for 26.7%, which means more than one minor out of 4. This disequality is not homogeneous. There are various percentages, various numbers. So, for example, in the Italian islands, we have 43.6%, so more than 1 out of 4. And if you consider a variable that is very close to actually the well-being, which is basically the qualification of the individual and of the family, we can see that in families where you have low qualifications, actually this number goes up to 50%, so from 26.7 to 51.8. And it goes down instead to 10.3% in the families where you have at least a graduate. And this is basically the whole topic around the social elevator and all the policies that we could enact in this respect to try and lower and go against these inequalities. And then, last but not least, let me briefly talk about the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals. This chart shows a number of bars. Green means the improving parameters. Green, the parameters that are worsening, and then stability is indicated by the yellow color. Compared to 10 years ago, over 50% of the parameters has improved, in particular accessible clean energy, the fight against climate change, and so on. Goals 15 and 16, that is to say life on Earth and clean water, as well as access to healthcare. The worst thing is that there is a worsening in quality education, and this is closely related to innovation, research, human capital, and so on. I'd like to stop here, and then, of course, I will add something if you want me to.
Allora prego.
Grazie.
Thank you. From the point of view of a private enterprise working in the pharmaceutical sector based on research and development, this is what we talk about Europe. Europe discourages and penalizes innovation through a series of regulations that should aim at putting the citizens at the center, but is actually jeopardizing the foundations of a very successful model that was introduced after the Second World War. And I explain what I mean by this. After the Second World War, until the beginning of the years 2000, the couple, so to speak, the pair capital and work actually ensured well-being, development, and also attention to the citizen. Italy, Germany, other countries developed systems that did work very well. Then a new phenomenon took place, that is to say, the introduction of the financial element in the economy. So capitalism was no longer based only on capital and work, but it was turned into a financial capitalism, which made of finance no longer a tool, but rather a goal. So new technologies also participated in creating this kind of model. So many economies, particularly the United States, turned into economies that exported services like financial services and technology, and they base their economies on this. What did Europe do during this period? From the point of view of real innovation, it didn't follow. European banks are smaller than American banks. It continued to invest in its own product, which is a product with a great value, but it continued to regulate this product with very heavy rules, thinking that this would enable the control over a changing world that had changed the capital work model that was at the base of our success. Today, as the Letta report says, we are in a difficult situation because by discouraging innovation, we are lagging behind. And I give a few examples. The example of the market I know best, the pharmaceutical market. We still have some enterprises, there's a big pharma, so to speak, in Italy that are as big as the big pharma in the United States. They have an enormous value and a great research capacity. So the clinic trials that are made to give access to a pharmaceutical product to the market should be done in the United States, whereas this is not exactly what happened at the beginning of the years 2000. We are really lagging behind, and today we are lagging behind not only if compared to the United States, but also to China. In spite of the resources we have in this sector, we have a pricing system that is horribly heavy. So the idea is pharmaceutical products need to be cheap so that everyone can have access to them. But this is wrong. Obviously, all people, or well, as many people as possible, need to have access to pharmaceutical products. But at the same time, we need to be quite ambitious. Innovation costs. It has to be paid for and valorized. This doesn't mean to do a favor to enterprises. It means to ensure that European citizens can benefit from innovative therapies. The report shows mental health as one of the issues that are going to be more problematic in the future. We are investing a lot in this sector, but what do we see? That about 80% of the research in this sector is American research. And there are some cases in which some products will never arrive in Europe because the price is 2 or 3 times lower than the price on the American market, because it is difficult to have in Europe a regulation that doesn't have any fears in saying if something is expensive but is worthy, well, it has to be accessible, it has to be used on our market as well. So, okay, it's okay to speak about this fifth freedom, this supranational law. But what do we mean about that? It's a series of regulations and provisions that are valid in many different countries. So this is what happens in Europe. It's a very good solution, no doubts about that. But this brings about conflicts. And so I do believe that what we should think of is what kind of market do we want? We want a market brave enough to pay for innovation, to invest in the skills and in the opportunities of Europeans to be entrepreneurs, or rather a market that is still focused in a wrong way to have a person at the center by thinking that the more rules I have, the less the citizen has to pay. Well, this is the question, I believe. In the end, we need to decide that we have tools that can enable to have more Europe, but first we need to understand what kind of market do we think should ensure the well-being and the wealth of European citizens. A market that is not afraid to pay for innovation, to invest in innovation, and to acknowledge the right place to innovation so that European citizens can have a more sustainable future.
Bernardo,
Buonasera, grazie intanto per questo nuovo invito a partecipare al meeting.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here once again. From our point of view, we lived a time, an era of neoliberalism that was rather hyper-regulated. But this is not so easy to hyper-regulate neoliberalism. Less attention was given to what, according to our way of thinking, to the social and to the social cohesion, and this led to imbalances and gaps between richer and poorer countries and regions. And this was not beneficial to the single market. We talked about productivity and innovation. In 1995, productivity in Europe was 95% of that of the United States. Today, it is 80% of that of the United States. This gap, we've seen that productivity has not grown enough over the last 25 years. This gap is to be found above all in the sector of technology, because of the development of technologies outside of Europe. And we didn't give enough attention to that. If we look at the data of productivity of high technological sectors, you'll see that the European productivity is in line with the Italian productivity. All this, as you can read in the Letta report, is accompanied by a fragmentation of regulations, as well as a complexity of regulations that in a way hinders investments in the European region. And let's talk about the equivalent duties. There are so many studies that deal with this and say that the equivalent tariffs on the European market for goods is about 45%. For services is over 100%. So, what is the issue here? From our point of view, Europe as it is not enough anymore. And I'm not talking quantitatively. I know there is a hyper-regulation, but it's the quality of the presence of Europe that needs to change. It needs to invest. Countries need to invest even where the market is not failing, channeling incentives and expenses in a very clear way. When Europe moved as a unit, for example, with the Next Generation EU, where a specific target was pursued, it did some very useful interventions. Now we need to go a step further and overcome this sense of urgency and turn all of this into a system, into a structure, so that from the procedural point of view, we can count on what we have thanks to the National Resilience and Recovery Plan. Now we are in the planning period up to the 2027 to 2027. And then there will be the new economic framework up to 2034. So you need to have dedicated resources. The European budget is smaller than the budget of other great powers, as the United States, or maybe even China. So we should give more attention to territorial cohesion. We need to have a performance-based approach using monitoring tools like the ones that were created with this recovery and resilience plan, but also focusing on those areas where the social cohesion is more important. And we cannot forget that this new financial aspect of economy is a cause, one of the causes of the fact that the human being is no longer at the center of economic development. We should actually focus on the human being as an entrepreneur, as a worker, and as a citizen. We have the cultural strength needed to do that in Europe.
So the floor to Enrico. I'd like to add that we conversed with Enrico also during the drafting of the report. That's the reason why it's interesting to know where we stand now. Thank you very much, and thanks a lot also for giving me the chance to address very interesting topics like the ones we've listened to. So, what's the core of the issue? When we touch upon these topics, we run the risk of touching upon many different subtopics. However, if I were to summarize everything in a nutshell, well, fact is that our generations have gone through the last 30 years, and they have lived, they've experienced something that had never happened before in the story of mankind. That is a mixture between demography and economic development. The economic development closely related to demography. The world has changed when the European single market was set up in the 1980s. I mean, in the world, we had a maximum 4 billion inhabitants, and now we have twice as many inhabitants, and the new inhabitants are not Europeans. They are non-Europeans. They live in other parts of the world, and technological development has, in a way, completely disrupted and completely altered the growing steps in these other parts of the world. China and India, in just 30 years, are doing exactly what we had done in 2 centuries. And today, we are facing a world, we're living in a world with 8 billion inhabitants. The Europeans are always the same in numbers, and size matters. Because we're living in a global market. And also, let's think about our own behavior as Italian consumers. We would have never thought about buying a Chinese car in the past, but actually this is an idea that has become dear to many Italians. Many Italians, for example, would have never thought about buying a roof covered with solar panels produced in China, but this has become the rule now. Why is this happening? It's happening because size, so scale sizes make it possible to have lower competitive prices, and we as Italians, we as Europeans are particularly hit by this, and we're paying it hard in Europe for all these things, especially because this fragmentation has ended up being a fragmentation that has, in a way, brought about serious problems of competitiveness and size. So there's a sector in which we are leaders worldwide. That's a very advanced sector, that is to say the aeronautical sector. We are leaders in that sector because in the end there's one great European group, which is Airbus. Airbus, together with Boeing, produces the vast majority of planes. And we are leaders in this field, we as Europeans, because we have just one Airbus. It brings together all the most important and most advanced European technology. Nobody can say that Airbus is Swedish or French or German. Airbus is a European organization. So our limitation here is that in Europe, all the financial and industrial initiatives basically are generated with some kind of a national passport. So their first limitation is not met in the US or China, but they find it at the border with their neighboring country. And I could make thousands of examples here. I know I'm going to lower the scientific quality of our debate because I'd like to share with you of a personal life experience that happened to me in Spain, but it would have been the same in Italy or in France. I started working for a university in Madrid, and I rented a small flat in Madrid. So I basically did everything that is needed when you want to rent a flat, including the change in the ownership, in the change of name in the bills for the provision of energy. So I called with the call center. She was very efficient. And then the call center in the end said, actually, we're ready for the signature. We just need two pieces of data. So I was supposed to give this additional, so the number of, so the bank details and the telephone number. So I gave them both details, bank details and telephone number, and there was actually silence at the other end. And so basically they did not understood what that IT at the beginning of the IBAN and then the plus 39, and they said, actually, I need a bank account number that actually starts with ES and a number that starts with plus 34. Otherwise, I see here that I cannot sign a contract for the provision of power with you. In other words, as you are here, you have to open a Spanish bank account and take a Spanish number. The same will apply to those who come to Italy. I confess that my first temptation was to tell him, listen, I'm going to tell you my report on the internal market telling you that I am entitled to be given, to be provided energy, even if I have an Italian bank account and an Italian number, because actually that gentleman was not to blame. But the rules that each country gives itself to protect their own services are to blame, and these rules are clashing against the rules of the internal market. The consequences was that, okay, actually, that I opened an additional bank account and an additional SIM card. But the problem is that actually you should understand this as the system logic. Every consumer sees basically himself rebounced on the Italian system. So my Italian bank was limited in that dimension. My IT telephone provider was limited, and so to cut a long story short, I just wanted to share with you what it means. So the idea of having a European framework, this actually 28th regime we were talking about before, the fact that we can tell an entrepreneur that he works at a European level with some kind of a fast track. The rules that apply to you whether you work in Vilnius or in Portugal or in Ireland. And this is not yet the case. We think that Europe is open, is united economically, but that is not the case. There are borders. Lots of things get blocked at the frontiers. Just give me a name of a European bank. Just mention a name of a European insurance company. You would only tell me names of Italian, Spanish, or French banks or insurance companies that have their own nationality. What's the difference here? The difference is they're an American bank. So an American, a U.S. financial system, as soon as it enters the market, it does so with the U.S. passport and not with the passport of Texas and California. Because of that, it can access the U.S. market, which makes up for 60% of the world financial market. And actually here, this is not the case. You have your own national passport and you stop at the borders. And as this happens, then the dimension is no longer the right dimension to compete on the market. And as Marullo Condojanni said before, we are living in a global market and we have to fight there. I mentioned the financial market because the push on innovation comes from regulations and from the fact that you have a financial market that is at that level. Have you ever thought about the reason why Americans have so far won in the battle for artificial intelligence or space? They didn't win it on public funds, but both were won thanks to the capacity that the US has of having a financial market capable of draining lots of private investments and of having a regulatory framework that supported them to go in that direction. Today, we don't have all that. So we lack the fifth freedom, and all the things that I tried to introduce in the report. This is now being discussed at a European level. Some of these things are already being addressed by community projects that have been presented by President von der Leyen. The problem is that over the last 6 months, the European Commission has been busy dealing with some priorities that have nothing to do with what we are talking about today. So having to fight a war on customs duties with the United States is something that goes against everything that we're talking about. It's a way to force Europe to actually put a lot of energy on something which is actually a lose-lose situation. Everybody will lose. Also, the US people will lose. They have nothing to win on that. It's a political battle played by Donald Trump just to tell themselves that he's defending them. In the end of the day, the economy is not a zero-sum game. It goes through all these decisions. This is just to say that we need to respond to this American challenge with greater integration and greater unity, allowing us to increase our level. Allow me to clarify what I mean. I'm not saying that we have to become giants. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that we have to become as the Americans. Europe is fantastic, and I think that Bernardo can tell us a lot of this based on his work he does with companies of various size. Europe is a fantastic mixture of both big and small. Small and big countries, small and big towns, small and big businesses. However, when the world was little was small, the great European would play in the World Championship. Today's great European, he's a national champion, he's not a European, is not capable of working in the World Championship because he's only a national champion. Actually, the small European of yesterday can remain small. He or she can remain small. However, there must be big players who are world players. Otherwise, they won't make it. And we are losing our battle there. Besides, together with the lack of innovation. Besides all these topics, there's also we should focus on the title much more than a market, very much in line with the title of this year's edition of the meeting. What we lack today is the sense of building with new bricks which, in my view, are based on the deep feeling that everything we've addressed so far is not just figures, mere figures. Behind the figures given to us by Professor Chelli, there's human beings. If our country has 26% of young people who are vulnerable because they're not adequately educated, actually, that's people. Just actually take 100 boys and girls and take 25 of them. It's people. It's our future. And we are not investing in that future. In this respect, Europe has to be at the core of these reflections because Europe brings values that are connected with this logic of development, which is much more than a market. I'm saying this because the topics of competitiveness we've addressed so far are meaningful if they are related to the values that make Europe attractive. Why is Europe attractive? So today, there are two concepts which basically are at the very basis of our attractiveness and strength. That is to say, the concept of peace, and freedom. We are at risk. Europe doesn't have a voice compared to what is happening in Gaza or compared to what is happening in the Ukraine. Europe is incapable, in a way, of imposing logics that lead to long-lasting peace. All of this is linked to the fact that we are on the borderline. Peace and freedom, peace and liberty are the most attractive element because all the issues related to competitiveness cannot hide one of the fundamental aspects that, once again, I'd like to clarify based on my experience. In drafting the report, I traveled throughout Europe. We met oftentimes. I have to thank Giorgio for the great support I received. And I also have to thank lots of industrial representatives, especially from the pharmaceutical sector. There's an episode that occurred to me. I crossed lots of internal frontiers in Europe. I crossed several times the Brenner Pass in Italy and Austria, or the Rhine between France and Germany, or the border between Poland and Germany. And each and any time, I couldn't but think that I was going through the border without noticing. So without having to show a pass or an identity card. However, I kept on thinking that underneath there were thousands of causes of young people who died before their 20s, because the world before the European Union was built in such a way that in our families, and each and any one of us has their grandmother or grandfather who told them these stories, the first son or the second son, etc., were sent to die or to kill, to push a frontier 20 kilometers to the south or to the north, or to the east or to the west. And that frontier, that's that frontier that we now cross, and we don't even realize why they died for that border. And this is something that up to 3 years ago could be rhetoric, but today it's no longer the case, because actually if you think about the families of the Ukrainians who organized that beautiful exhibition we have here at the meeting, or let's talk to the families of the Russians whose sons are on the front line to fight for a frontier that we will cross freely in 100 years' time. That's why freedom and peace are so fundamental, and that's why these values are so important. So the freedom of the peoples, why is this so important? The freedom of peoples means that today we show our solidarity with oppressed peoples, because the fact that they can choose where they want to be is an integral part of the most important European value, which is people's self-determination. That's why when I listen to Trump talking about Panama or Greenland or Canada as the vital interests of the United States, actually I shiver. Because it is the peoples who decide where they want to be. And that story that was decided upon in Yalta, where frontiers were made on the plan, on the map, and then our friends from Hungary and Poland found themselves at the other side. That happened because there were other people who without them decided where they had to be. Today, the value of people's self-determination, of an international law based on the rules and not on the law of the strongest, of the most powerful. So I'm the most powerful, and so I decide where you are because you are the weakest. The great strength of Europe lies in this. If you don't believe me on this, well, I'll give you another example. Far away from our home, we have Ireland. The Irish are one of the most beautiful European peoples. If we hadn't had Ireland, Ireland would have been knocked down by England's Brexit choice. They wanted that frontier. We all remember the Sunday, Bloody Sunday song by the U2. So that frontier had been shown again. It was Europe who decided, a small country, so Ireland, so that the rights of the Irish were rights which were fundamentally justified, be that people big or small. When talking about competitiveness and the attractiveness of Europe, these values are extraordinarily fundamental. The biggest European attraction is that of our European values, and we have to defend them.
Allora chiederei ai nostri interlocutori un breve...
I'd like to ask our guests a very brief final comment to what has been said. You can take the order you prefer. Yes, I agree. We need more Europe, a bigger Europe. But why doesn't this really happen? Because in a content where European acquis prevails on the national rights, it is impossible to have a common financial tool. So I do believe that we need to have a bigger market, more Europe, a bigger scale in a world that becomes more and more competitive. But the question, I believe, is what's the idea behind this? We cannot have more Europe. We cannot have a common law because maybe we don't know where we want to go and how we want to defend our model. So actually, Airbus is a very good example because the added value here is quite clear to everyone. In other sectors, this is less clear. And this is what I was saying before about innovation in a world where we are less and less, so to speak. We need to defend our standard of living. Either we create more added value, or in the end, we will be all poorer. So if we do not promote an idea of a Europe that encourages the creation of added value through innovation, no supernatural rule will be able to survive. As an enterprise, more Europe, yes. As an entrepreneur, more Europe. We have to have also a shared idea of where we want to go to defend our model where people are always at the center, thanks to our Christian and Jewish roots. Well, there are so many things that could be said. I would like to thank Professor Letta for his suggestions. One thing that really touched me is this landscape, this picture that Enrico Letta illustrated on the fact that Europe is losing its own weight. As Enrico Letta said, size matters. There are many studies that link well-being with population, so the scale is really important here. A nation with a few inhabitants is insignificant. But there was another thing that I wanted to say before. Last year, we lost about 10,000 birds. And we arrived at about 369,000. So if we project this loss of the first 5 years, or 5 months of the years, about minus 5%, if we multiply this for 12 months, we will go beyond the loss of 10,000 births. So we will have less people in Europe. This is something that has to make us think. The loss of birth has to be tackled. The French family minister came here and wanted to talk about the demographic problem in Italy. Well, we have always said that Italy had always been a nation that had, France had always been a nation that knew a lot about the demographic issues, but now they're coming to us to ask us how we are reacting. This is, in a way, a little bit worrying. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the meeting in Jackson Hall of the Senate of the governors of central banks. On the first day, Claudia Gordon, an economy Nobel Prize, talked as a first topic of demography, and in particular the decrease in births. It's a problem that concerns the whole of the Western world. in particular Europe, because now we already have experienced a decrease in population, and so this makes us different from other countries like China and India, and also Africa that continues to grow in terms of population. So we should think about this, because then this problem will become bigger and bigger. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Enrico for his quotation, and I would like to say that it is true that there are small and medium enterprises that are extraordinary in Italy, in the southern Italy. What are the sectors where these operate? For instance, the aeronautic sector in Apulia and in Campania works for Airbus, for instance, but they also work for Japan, for the United States, for other big realities that are not European. So we need to invest a lot on this. There are less, so to speak, physical borders in our continent. There are more financial and economic borders. So I would like to ask you, what can Europe do? Are we very far from really being able to take part in the game? Well, I take this opportunity to go back also to what Marullo was saying before. In the last few days and weeks, we have been overwhelmed by messages where you see someone in an oval room all alone signing executive orders, taking decisions, changing from 15% to 50%. And he does this all on his own. On the other hand of the world, on the other side of the world, there is someone else who's also alone, who decides about war, about the life of people. I'm talking about Moscow, obviously, Putin. And then there is a Chinese system. There is not just one person. There is a very complicated system. But the substance is that in the world lately, there are dynamics that are based on vertical power. This is the challenge that we have to face today in Europe, because the vertical power in Europe is, from my point of view, politically impossible and not feasible, because we are 27 countries. We needed to coexist. We even speak different languages. Well, living in Brussels, I can say that we have made a lot of progress when the United Kingdom left. It is a paradox in a way, because now there is a language that everyone speaks, the so-called bad English. Since there are no native speakers there anymore, we are not afraid of speaking English badly. Well, there are the Irish, but, well, this actually confirms my theory. Well, this process has a lot of difficulties, about this vertical power. So we need to have a collective European leadership is seen as something possible. The President of the European Commission, the President of the European Parliament, the leader of European countries should jointly make choices. Without leadership, we won't be able to do anything. So this is my answer to my colleagues here. Without this collective leadership, we will not be able to take the choices, to make the decisions that we have to make. You talk about the decrease, the problem of demography, but this can be done only by integrating new Europeans. We cannot think to have millions of babies in Europe in the next 2 years. So we need to integrate new Europeans. But the leadership continues to be fundamental. So to conclude, Giorgio, I want to share with you an image, a picture that shows how leadership is linked with factors that are very difficult to understand, but they are connected with the development of people and with courage. When I think about leadership, I have an image in my mind that is, we talked about innovation. Well, in our history, innovation was extremely strong on two different paths. One was very fast, the other one was very slow. You arrived here with your suitcase, and we all travel with our wheeled suitcases, trolleys. The less young people here know that the wheeled suitcases, that is an invention that has changed our life, did not exist when we were children. When we used to travel back then, we would have to carry our suitcases. There were no wheels. I believe they were created in 1987. So this is an invention which is completely basic for us today. So it is an invention that was introduced randomly because a pilot started to think that it was too difficult to carry a suitcase every day. So why? Because in the past, on this theme, there was no leadership, no innovation, no investment. So what do I want to tell you? Wheeled suitcases were invented decades after the first men set foot on the moon. So obviously it is quite more difficult to send man to the moon than adding wheels to a suitcase. But why did this happen 20 years before? Because for leadership reasons, one person in 1961-62, I don't remember, said, I wanted to it was Kennedy, President Kennedy, I wanted to mobilize the energies of the whole of our country towards a single target. At the end of this decade, we will bring man on the moon. And it was quite visionary and risky. But that leadership mobilized the whole country, and in the end, in 1961, men set foot on the moon. 20 years before, the wheeled suitcase was invented. So, well, attention, because everything we're saying today are always based on the person, the force, the risk, the innovation, the vision of a person can have. So if there is no vision, there is no future. And this, in a way, is a bit the title of the Rimini meeting this year. Thank you.
Allora voglio
I'd like
trarre qualche breve conclusione proprio su questo spunto.
I'd like to conclude. So this person, where does this person come from? Well, our enemy is everything that is mechanic, that is done in a mechanic way, an organization that doesn't change. So a lively person has a condition, something that President Violante said, we need thinking communities. We need places where people, like we did today, thinks about something like the Letta report, just because they want to learn something, to know something. Enlightenment in Milan did not cut off heads, and it was, on the contrary, a positive element for the church, for the innovation that led to entrepreneurship and of justice as well. Because there was a place, a cafe or a place where people met to think, and they didn't know that this would have any kind of future, because the moon and the wheeled suitcase need places where people think, like we did here today, even if they do not know what is going to be the immediate result. So this is what is needed, what we're doing here, to create, to build a person. We don't need to go back to Thatcherian beliefs or the Oval Office or Putin's desk. We need places where people think, because these are the thinking communities that generate the innovation of persons and the capacity to see the examples of the others. But even before this, in order to have thinking communities, as we said in the past, is Pope Ratzinger's idea of creative minorities. Europe is a place of creative minorities, because it's a place where people think because they live together. Let's think about monasteries. Just like Father Giussani a few years ago, referring to McIntyre, said we didn't need to support the empire, but rather to build places of life where everyday life is shared. This is where the real thinking is born. So leaderships are born because there are creative minorities and thinking communities who, this is the story of our democracy, give birth to leaders that belong to these places. And because of this belonging, they can do something. So Europe has to go back to the path. The European Parliament needs to be expression of these ideas. Because if you belong to creative minorities and thinking communities, you enjoy being with someone who's different from you, be it another country, be it another political party, and then finding compromises and solutions that are new and innovative. For instance, let's think about what happened during the COVID pandemic. Europe managed to find a common solution. So we have to go back to this idea of democracy that is based on intermediate bodies and is not limited to lectures given by people coming from no one knows where, but they are the real expression of this world. I do think that this is the message of this meeting and one of the most important elements of the Rimini meeting. Thank you.
Grazie.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte.
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo
Proporre con la propria vita.
esiste anche grazie a te.